This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for Care Notes with Cherished Companions and Doug Wilber. Doug, I have something that I've been holding back to tell you. I've been referring people to Cherished Companions in the last month. Um, I
Well,
have
that's probably
seen,
good and bad, right?
I have been hearing people talking about, I don't even know where to go for home care. And why should I do home care rather than, go to a facility? And I just keep sending them the link, to Cherished Companions, but also telling them, hey, listen to some of the podcasts. Because
Mhm.
if you're going to choose home care, make sure you do your due diligence, but meet with somebody who has the experience and is
Mhm.
involved.
Yeah.
And I had two of them contact me and say, thank you. Everything we've seen about Cherished Companions is exactly what we're looking for. So
Well,
I
thank
think
you.
after all these years, we're finally starting to hit the buttons, and I'm really glad for that.
Yeah, it's funny because in the last 2 days I've had some really wonderful feedback, not related specifically to what you had to say, but someone told me they reached out not too long ago to um, a, a social media site, and they didn't say which one it was, but they said when they did, they were just asking for help. And they said they got 6 different people that said our name specifically, um, and yeah, it's stuff like that that warms my heart because we could do a lot of advertising, and there are national chains that do it, and frankly, the type of advertising I've always wanted was someone saying, we had a good experience
Right.
using this company, or, they had, the perfect caregiver for my mom, or even, and this is also a good thing. We had a caregiver that wasn't great, and when they put in a new one,
Yep,
because they
exactly.
wanted to get the right fit. And so those things, are things that I say, okay, we're doing the right thing with this. Yeah, actually, the second thing I heard is someone had called one of the other agencies, and again, who will go unnamed, and they said that when they called, they said um, they got put off several times by this. One time, someone just never showed, and
Um,
mistakes happen. Things
sure,
can
sure.
go on where someone just makes an honest mistake, but it actually happened repeatedly with some things like that with this same agency. And they said, you were here, like the next day type of a thing. And again, the doing the due diligence, meeting and getting to know is really important. Um, and and honestly, that's part of what we're talking about. I'm wanting to do kind of an idea around aging in America,
Okay.
and specifically, I want to go into what the system isn't telling you, um, and why home care is the answer. I believe. Um, so, I do want to welcome people to Care Notes. Our goal here is truly um, to make a difference in people's lives by sharing information. It's there's an idea that I have, and that is, and it's I'm not the creator of this idea, but I think it's important is that we venerate those who are older. There was a for those that are in the baby boom generation, there was a saying, don't trust anyone over 30. And then
Yeah.
obviously the baby boomers turn 30 and they change
Yeah.
their, their mind on that concept. But one thing that I think we've lost in our culture is the whole idea of aging and our elders being important and what can be provided. Someone the other day looked at me and they said, um, you're going to continue to do well. This was someone who was older. And I kind of looked at her and she said, and do you know why? I said, no. And she said, because you're talking to me. And and people as they age start to experience this thing where they're not being talked to, they're being talked at or
Right.
talked about. And I'm very conscientious about including people in that whole conversation. And because someone may have dementia, they may have forgetfulness, they may be falling or having issues around things that are going on in their lives, but they still want to be a part of the decision making process.
Absolutely.
And you can, even with all of those things going on, and shame on someone who condescends to another person because of something physically or mentally that's going on with them in their lives. And I know we've talked about it. You
Sure.
mentioned that one time about your husband and
Right.
how he felt that day, when he was in the ER, if I
Right.
remember right. Yeah. So what I want to kind of explore today is um, uh, what in the system is broken, what's coming, and probably most importantly, how strategically using home care it can be probably the smartest and most humane way forward for our healthcare system when it comes to aging. And so I guess maybe we should start with this. Every day, I, I think the statistic is about 10,000 Americans are turning 65 every single day. And by 2030, 1 in 5 Americans are going to be over the age of 65. Matter
Wow.
of fact, all of the baby boomers will then be, officially,
Sure.
um, yeah, seniors,
Right.
if you
Statistically old.
yeah, statistically old. Um, uh, but I've used this statistic before, but somewhere between 87, 90%, there's different measures, but of those individuals want to age in their own homes. They do not want to be in a facility. They don't want to be in a hospital setting. Um, it's home. That's where they want to be. Um, so I guess the question ultimately is, can our system support that? And right now, the answer is absolutely not. There's absolutely no way that we can support it. But it could if we start using home care strategically. And I think that's important. Home care is a new field. And because it's a new field, it hasn't really been understood where this fits into this. I mean, we um, we know in part how it fits, but we're trying to fit it in the way that it uh, has been done in the past, and that is Our healthcare model is really built on the idea um, that people go to institutions to be treated um, after they are sick or injured. So that's the mindset. Um, but with seniors, preventive and supportive care in the home is oftentimes more effective and drastically, like incredibly cheaper if you do that. And but it's a mindset change that has to happen. Now, the other things are that caregivers are burnt out. We know that, anyone who's done caregiving at some point in time in that process, they will probably use a term or a term similar to being, I'm burned out. I can't
Sure.
take this. Um, there are approximately, I think statistically, 53 million family caregivers in the United States.
Wow.
Um, and you think about who's doing the caregiving, and I can tell you a list of people. Most often it is the children, but not always. And usually they're going to be 20 to 30 years younger than the person that they're caring for. So they're going to be juggling careers, children, grandchildren, you know,
Right.
their care duties. Um, and our system is completely relying on that unpaid labor. Um, but we're not really supporting them. We're depending on it, but we're
Yep.
not supporting them if you're looking at from a policy standpoint. Now, yeah, there's going to be a lot of argument, is the government responsible for it or whatever? But I can tell you that, that if we didn't have those 53 million people in place, the system would be completely overwhelmed overnight uh, because they're keeping people out of hospitals, out of facilities, out of situations that would cost the system a lot of money. And we do know this. We know that facilities are not the answer. They're costly. They're already overstretched. We've talked about how COVID laid bare of the weaknesses. They're increasingly seen as a last resort. But what families ultimately, I think, really want is some way to get dignified and consistent and flexible care at home. I mean, that's what I would say.
Right.
How does that all sound to you?
Well, I've always wondered, and many of these facilities are not just a couple $1,000s a month, they're thousands of dollars a month. And number one, they're paying for their building, they're paying for all the staffing and everything else that goes in. And I know that, you know, Medicare doesn't pay anything for that. Now, if you're on Medicaid, if you go to a Medicaid facility,
Approved. Yeah,
you can, get the funding. But I've always wondered why our society doesn't look at it and say, look how much we can save if people can stay at home.
yeah,
You don't have to pay these hundreds of thousands of dollars. I know when my mother first moved into where she went, this is quite a while ago, but I believe it was like $3,000 a month. Today, that same facility is like 5 times that, and they only get one meal a day. The other
yeah,
two are on your own. And so $15,000 a month. I mean, I know
right.
it's not going to cost $15,000 a month. They have home care. And with
Yeah,
home care, you can get that one-on-one that many are going to eventually need. They may not need it immediately, but eventually, as we get older and other things creep into our bodies, yes, we're going to need more care. I just don't understand. And that's why I've said to my boys, either I'm staying in my house or I'm coming and living in your house because
yeah,
you'll have more money when I'm gone if we do it that way. Plus, I don't want strangers in there and touching me, and I want that companion of a healthy
Right.
group.
And the big thing I think is as we are looking at the big picture, street, strategic home care is going to be the future. I think it's the only viable option that we have that that preserves the dignity of the individual. I mean, there are other things that can be done, and you could,
Sure.
have people move into village settings, and there's, other option type of things. But I really think that the strategic use of home care is going to give what most people want in the setting that they want it. And but we have to stop looking at home care as just an option, and we need to look at it as a strategy. Yeah, ultimately, I think
Yep.
that's the only way it's going to work is if we see, okay, this is strategically a part of that grand picture and how to deal with this large group of aging people in our population. Um, so a good home care plan can ultimately delay or prevent hospitalizations. We know, and we can break this down in a bit, but hospitalizations are costly. You can support recovery at home after illness and surgery, which leads to less
Yep.
hospitalizations or rehospitalizations. We can manage or at least help manage chronic conditions more effectively by having, some sort of eyes and strategic plan for those individual. Uh, for those people that those 50 3 million Americans that are doing home care for their family members, we can prevent the burnout of those individuals and hopefully preserve the well-being of that family.
Sure.
And I think what this ultimately leads to is keeping people safe and happy at home for many years longer than otherwise would happen. Um, so maybe, as I mentioned, we can break down to yeah, how this can happen. So
Sure.
hospital avoidance, okay, falls, infections, medication errors. These are the top reasons that seniors end up in the hospital: falls, infections, medication errors. But with a trained home care aide checking in regularly, many of these incidents can be completely prevented, and that's huge because the average hospital stay for a senior costs over $13,000. That's a crazy amount of money.
Yes, it is.
$13,000. So think about all the hours of care you could get for that $13,000. And I mean, it's crazy the how cost effective home care can be with just prevent one hospitalization,
Right.
and you've not only made someone's life a heck of a lot better, you're costing less. And I know this for a fact. One of the things that we do is um, we work with Geauga County Department on Aging, and we're one of their primary providers that they have used for giving people a small number of hours. And we do typically about 4 hours a week for individuals. And I've seen where this has made a, uh, a major difference in the life of these seniors. And you would think, well, what would 4 hours do? But believe me, it makes a giant difference. And we do this because, in my view, this is one of our ways of giving back to the
Sure.
community. That it, and because I truly believe that and I think it's really proven out that it does make a difference. So much of a difference that I think there's a year or a year and a half waiting list to get
Wow.
care through the department on aging out there. So, um, but without proper aftercare, oftentimes these people end up, not the ones from Geauga County, but the
Right.
ones who are hospitalized within 30 days. Um, what I found is that home care bridges that gap. It helps people to do their follow-ups. It helps people um, to get on their medications and to be compliant. It helps with nutrition. It helps with safety. It helps with a bunch of different things. And I've seen this time and again at Cherished Companions. Just a few hours daily for many people can dramatically improve those outcomes and prevent that rehospitalization. Now, strategically place care plans for those with dementia and chronic disease management. Oftentimes, we'll do living care for people, where we'll do overnight support. And what we find is that can reduce things like wandering or people taking their medicines, or even be a support for the family. Caregivers are there. But we know, and I've said this over and over with Alzheimer's and with dementia, home care is not only preferred, it is the much safer route in almost all cases, and it is the better route. I cannot tell you the number of times I've seen people who are thriving at home. They've gone into a facility that specializes in dementia, and within months they've passed. And this is not to knock those dementia units. I really believe that those dementia units are necessary and they're important in the overall plan. But it's being home is definitely better.
We,
Just in most cases, again, there are the exceptions.
we saw
Um,
this happen to my mother-in-law. She had a very bad UTI. When she would get a UTI, it was like she had dementia.
oh yeah.
Um, and it was so bad, she was rushed to the hospital. The hospital made the decision that she could no longer live on her own. And as she got better and was being released from the hospital, she was being sent to a facility, and they told her for rehab. And she was smart enough. She knew her brain was
Mhm.
intact. And she said, I'm not going there to live. And they said, well, it's just for rehab. And luckily, initially, she was on the rehab side. And within 2, 3 days, she was walking around. She was doing everything she needed to do. They now needed to release her. Luckily, they didn't have an apartment or a room available for her at the facility. So they asked
Mm,
us what we wanted them to do.
yeah.
And my brother-in-law and sister-in-law got involved, and they found a facility overnight, moved her in, and she went downhill in 4 months.
Yeah.
And, you know, did she have some memory issues? I'm sure she did. She was 96 years old. Okay. But she had still been driving. She was taking care of herself. She never missed her meds. And when we saw her going downhill, we didn't know what we could do. Our
Yeah.
place wasn't big enough to have her move in. My brother and sister-in-law had no desire to have her move in. And so we had to watch that. So I agree with you. If we could have kept her at home and if she needed help, bring in the help. Number one, it would have
Mhm.
been a lot less than what we spent for the facility care. And
Yeah.
I think we would have had her for a much longer time.
Yeah, and oftentimes people are making the best decisions they can under the circumstances. That's why I'm doing these podcasts in part because I think if you can think through things, if you can like um, get experience and from other people's experiences, it can make a really big difference because when you are in the middle of that, you're grasping for straws. You don't know this. It's like anything. We tend to learn things when we need to learn things, not usually before we need to learn
Right.
things. And, we only have so much capacity. But I do think that, and I talked about this in some of the other podcasts, we really need to start developing proactive aging plans. Um, what I'm starting to see is that there are those forward-thinking families that are using home care just not just when there's a crisis, and but really as a part of a life plan. And that, as I was alluding to before, a few hours a week for companionship, housekeeping, can evolve over time into medication support and mobility help, and eventually full-time care. Yeah, and but this progressive model is what I find works the best. It actually works beautifully. It kind of reduces trauma in many respects. The trauma of all of a sudden having to go to 24-hour care, the trauma that can happen from a needless fall or something else. I think it helps preserve people's dignity and really truly supports health over an extended period of
Sure.
time. And those things I think um, is why, or that idea is why being proactive is really the preferred model. It's really the preferred way of going. Um, and let's just talk dollars and cents. And you were,
Okay.
had kind of alluded to that before as so in the national average, the urban areas is generally going to be more expensive. A good facility is going to
Right.
typically be more expensive than others. Rural areas are likely to be less expensive at times if they have the help. But the national average for the cost of a private nursing home room is about $108,000 a year. And assisted living, it's about $64,000 a year. Um, if you look at 20 hours of home care, and on a weekly basis, your costs are going to be different from that. And,
Sure.
and oftentimes you don't need to, go to even 20 hours of care. But in the end, you may be talking about 30 to $40,000 a year if you're needing a lot of care, and that's what the average hours would be nationally when someone was doing 20 hours of
Sure.
in-home care per week. Um, my question is, why do you think more families don't choose home care?
I really think the answer is so many of us are not aware, or it's not even so much the awareness. We've been drilled into this, well, this is better for your parent because they're going to have 24/7 care.
Hmm.
And in the very good places, they probably are getting 24/7 care and there's more one-on-one care. But the average places, like you said, healthcare workers are burned out. And in the bigger facilities, they don't tend to get paid real well. I just talked to two um, healthcare workers the other day who, after 20 years, have given it up. And one said she was finally making $14 an hour in a
Wow.
facility. And
Yeah.
she said she had to pay for her health care as well. So she said it was easier for her to do that than to go do it on her own. Um, and I asked her, I said, why didn't you look at home care? And she said, I truly didn't think about it because when I started, I went into a
That was the bath.
right.
Yeah.
And so, she's
I
now,
hope you gave her our number when she
yeah,
was
she doesn't live in
going.
town. I wish she did because I think she would go to work for you right away. But I think it's important. Again, we keep talking about it because I know we kept my grandfather with us for a year. We didn't shoo him out. He chose to go. He wanted to live with his contemporaries.
Yeah.
And he lived in a place where he loved it. Okay. But I remember as a child, I was terrified to go in there
Mm,
because people who weren't as agile as he were, they were strapped onto a chair.
yeah.
And that I wouldn't want that for anybody.
Yeah. No. And fortunately, we're not in that era anymore. There,
Thank God. Yes.
yeah. Um, but I think part of the issue is because home care hasn't really been part of the whole equation. Things like Medicare is really not covering home care. I
Right.
mean, there are some advantage plans that supposedly do it, but it really has not been um, integrated into, and especially not seen as a strategic part of,
Right.
and that's probably a policy flaw. In some ways, I think it's been good because I do think, it's allowed home care to kind of develop. And when the government gets involved, they all oftentimes do muck things up. I
Right.
hate to say this, but there's rules and regulations and different things that complicate things, and so there's good parts to that, and there's bad parts about it. This I think is allowing home care, at least right now, to kind of get its legs and to understand where it fits into the overall pattern. And I think it's probably, um, without the regulations, has probably in many ways been a better thing overall. Maybe at some point in time, it'll need to be pulled
Sure.
in. But what it does, because it's not covered by Medicare, it's oftentimes not really seen as a part of the whole equation and people. But Medicare, other than Medicare is also not paying for, um, like they'll pay for rehab, but they're not paying for someone to be
Right.
in a facility for like long-term care in those cases. Medicaid will when someone has depleted all their
Right.
resources. But here's the big thing is that there's a planning flaw, and that's strategic home care requires proactive thinking. It's not a crisis driven um, uh, model, or shouldn't, excuse me, it shouldn't be a crisis driven model. It should be something where we're incorporating it into our
Sure.
thinking. And because it's relatively new, I don't believe that that has really happened to the degree that it needs to. But I would say, and I've harped on this before, that the key is starting early. The earlier the better. When someone starts having a little bit of need, start getting help, and and make it finite. I mean, and but I do think if you do it before the hospital visit, if you do it before that person is completely burned out, if you do it before the finances have been spent, you're, I think, in much better shape overall. So what I do recommend is that families start taking control and they do it at that early stage. So as I mentioned before, um, you know, you need to look at the home, and you need to start planning at the home. Is this the place that needs to be where you can age in place? And couples should be doing that with each other. Is this where
Right.
we need? And if we do, what do we need to do? So you grab the checklist,
Yes.
and you look at the bathrooms, you look at the entryways, you look at lighting, you look at where the falls can happen, and literally, a few minor changes can save someone thousands of dollars because of hospital bills,
Exactly.
other things like that that can happen, or just the need for intensive care because you fell down a set of steps because you didn't have a hand ramp,
Right.
you know, and have the conversation. You talk to the parents or your loved ones about what they want and what they don't want, and I think asking that question early on, if you know something like, if it were up to you, how would you want to age? Where would you want to
And to
age?
age. Yes.
And then, as I said before, start small. Someone running errands and someone's not driving well. Instead of them getting into an accident and having an issue, um, you know, um, start getting those errands done and the driving happening for someone, whatever it is. You have to find out, okay, where's the danger points? Okay, how can we prevent those danger points from becoming truly, a problem?
Absolutely.
um, and then you layer services over time. So I believe when care is introduced gradually, it's actually more effective. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's far less emotionally jarring, when you do that. But also you're making good decisions because you're making informed decisions, not rush decisions. You're not in panic mode when you're making those decisions. And so often it's the panic mode that drives, people being put into a facility prematurely.
Right.
Uh, um, and then, obviously, I have a bias in this, but you got to choose the right agency.
Yeah.
you know, um, so often I'll tell people, because I'm the one meeting with them, if you're not comfortable with me, we're probably not the right agency,
Exactly. Yep. Yep.
because hopefully, what we do is going to reflect what my desire is,
Sure.
and but the other thing, I've said this before, is this is a scheduling business. You're going to have issues. You're going to have things that are going to occur. It's going to happen because it's a people business. And
Right.
so, you know, the you have to be comfortable with that um, agency to be able to work with you through those issues and get it resolved, bring a resolution to a problem, because anyone who tells you they're not going to be you're never going to have a problem with them is
That's
selling you a
not
bill
true.
of goods. They are. It's just I guarantee you they're selling you something rather than trying to bring you service. And experience matters. Our 16 years does make a difference. It does.
Absolutely.
We've seen many things, and consistency is going to matter. Having good caregivers over time. And, agencies like ours, you know, are going to train, they're going to vet, they're going to match caregivers appropriately to the needs of the client.
Sure.
uh, it's you're trying to match someone with someone else, and you have to take all those things into consideration. Um, so if I were to kind of wrap things up, I would say if you're a caregiver, a home caregiver, a family caregiver, you're not alone. You know, you got to seek help. You got to get the respite, and don't wait till you're absolutely overwhelmed and you think, believe me, you will need a lot more hours of care
Right.
when you're at that point. And then if you go ahead and do it, in the end, you're going to spend, either the same amount or more. You might as well, get the help so you're not in that burned out position. Um, if someone's planning for their own future, um, take ownership. Start today. Don't wait until someone else is making the decisions
Right.
for you. You have to have the agency to be able to say, okay, this is what I want, this is how I want it, and not through wishful thinking, but through planned, um, reasoned thinking. Like, okay, if I want to stay in my own home, I need to make a shower I could roll a wheelchair into.
Yep.
You know, I'm going to pay the money because this is where I want to be. Don't pretend like I will never need it, because um, you have to plan for the worst case scenario, that I will probably need this. And I oftentimes tell people, when they're planning, plan for their worst day, not their best. It's just, that's what you have to plan for.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Um, and, obviously, for those people out there that are in healthcare, or who are in the policy decision making part of our culture, it really is time to start looking at home care as a part of the continuum. If you're in the Cleveland Clinic hospital system, or if you're in University Hospitals in Cleveland, or if you're in the things, it's not, this is not an add-on. Okay, it's not a luxury item for someone. It has to be seen as a part of the overall healthcare continuum.
Sure.
And it will be to everyone's advantage when we see that fully, as a part of the system. So the system, as I started out with, it may not be ready for this wave of people who are aging. But I really think we can be, you know, and I think part of that is by using home care strategically, proactively, and hopefully compassionately in taking care of those that are our elders,
Absolutely.
and um, those of us that are over 65, it's also our friends, and it's our brothers and sisters and stuff. And so, we need to cry out that this is really important, and that really needs to be thought of in the right way. So, I guess I want to thank people for, joining us today. I hope this sparks something. you
I
know,
think it will. And it's an important discussion and we'll continue to have it. So thank
yeah.
you, Doug. We'll talk to you next month.
Okay,
Bye-bye now.
thanks. Bye-bye.